Kia ora koutou. Welcome to the first of our I330 sessions. For this session, I'm going to be sharing my whiteboard on a screen. So if you've got any questions, just ask them in the instant messenger box. The I3 project, and the three I's stand for integration, implementation, and impact, has been running for a couple of years to support integrative research in Manaaki Whenua. Last year, we launched a suite of resources on doing integrative research called the Research Toolkit. And these I330 sessions are working through some of those resources on that website. The I330 format is a bit of an experiment to see if I can get across some useful methods and concepts about doing integrative research in 30 minutes. So we'll try a few and then see, and I'll come back to you after the event to collect some feedback to see what we need to adapt for the next session. So we thought to structure the session into what it is, this interest and influence mapping, why use it, when use it, and how to use it. And there'll be a few minutes at the end when you can instant message any questions, and we'll answer as many as we can in the time. And then the rest we'll answer after the event and share the responses. So what is it? So influence and interest mapping is a pretty simple tool, and it's to help you decide who to work with in a project. So identifying both who might be influential on the research and the outcomes and who might be interested. You can use it for both external stakeholders. You can also use it for internal stakeholders, internal to Manaaki Whenua, for example. So it's a scoping tool, but it can also help set some boundaries. So these are a couple of terms that we'll use quite a lot, this scoping and boundary setting, over the next few sessions of these I330s. So scoping is going wide, so considering all of the possibilities. And then boundary setting is the project team actually making explicit decisions about what it is that they're going to do. So for example, in deciding who you're going to work with, when you're scoping, you consider all of the possibilities, and then when you set boundaries, you actually decide, the project team decides who it is they're actually going to prioritize and work with. So why use it? Especially with more integrative impact-focused research, but I guess with all research, deciding who to include and who to exclude are really influential decisions. So this is both when you're developing up the project, for the perspectives that you include when you're considering what it is that you're going to work on, and the stakeholders that you include in the project as it goes on. So I often say that this is one of the most, deciding who it is that you're going to talk to or who it is you're going to work with is one of the most influential decisions that you're going to make in your research projects. So this tool can help you make some of these decisions a bit more purposefully and more transparently. So it's a scoping tool, but it can help you set some of those boundaries. So when do you use it? So I tend to use it at a couple of stages quite early on in a project. First, I use it quite informally. So when very first thinking about an area of work, I might kind of sit down with a colleague or two and use it to think about people or organizations who might have a stake in this area of work, who might have a view on what research needs to be done, and therefore who I might need to talk to when I'm developing up the research questions. Second time I use it is a bit more formally with a diverse group, often informed by the first time I've used it. But yeah, in a diverse group, again, pretty early on in the project development to get a really rich picture of who the project could work with and then make some decisions about who the project should work with. And in terms of how to use it, so as I said, it's pretty simple, but quite often when we are thinking about who it is that we're going to work with, then we quite often think about the kind of same old people. So to stop you and the other participants just listing the same people you normally think of, there are a series of questions designed to prompt a wider consideration of influence and interest. So how you do it is you put your project title or the area you're going to work with on a piece of paper or on a whiteboard, and then you get people to list individuals or organizations in response to these questions. And remember, it's a scoping exercise, so you want to get people to put down all of the possibilities. You're not committing to kind of working with all of these people. So I thought that I would just have a kind of a fictitious example that we just work through. So in this example, we've got localized sedimentation in coastal streams and near shore, which is impacting on fishing and kaimoana gathering. So you want to get people to think about who has got relevant knowledge. So this might be, in this case, this might be farming knowledge, local knowledge, knowledge on food gathering, knowledge about getting practice change or policy knowledge. If you were thinking internally, you might think about the different disciplines that might need to be included, whether you need to include informatics, whether you need to include the design team. So then you want to get people to think about who's affected. So who's affected by the problem, who's affected by the solution, any of the solutions that might arise, who's affected by action or inaction. Next, you want to get people to think about who has the power to influence. So this isn't just decision-making power, so things like regional councils or other agencies, but also get people to think about a couple of other different types of power. So moral power. So these are moral power, so individuals or organizations who speak for shared interests. So for example, environmental NGOs often exert a moral power. And in this fictitious example, we have a marae at the bottom of the catchment. So they will speak for shared interests, so they have moral power. Also think about social power. So this is power held by individuals or organizations with status and respect. So influences in a community, or as we quite often see, social networks and movements on social networks have quite a lot of social power. So think about those different types of powers as well as the more traditional structural power. Then you want to get people to think about, are there people whose voices might not be heard? So a good example of this is future generations. So future generations of people living in this catchment might be pretty interested in fishing and kaimoana gathering, but they might not have any influence. So think about those, but also you could think people who might not live in the area, or vulnerable groups, people who find it quite difficult to get involved. So you want to think about, are there people who are not currently in positions of power or influence, but who are necessary? Might be necessary in the solution. So again, in this example, there might be a marae garden in the bottom of the catchment, so they're not really generating very much sediment, and the sediment's not really affecting them, but they use permaculture practices, and these practices might have an important role to play in the research or in the outcome. Thinking about who will be responsible for managing outcomes. So is it policy? Is it through direct intervention or advice? So do you need industries or regional councils or other types of agencies? Thinking about, certainly for more contentious projects, who are potential allies and opponents? Who can facilitate or impede the project? And do you need to get them involved? And finally, who can contribute financial or technical resources? So once everybody's made a long list, then kind of bring that list together as a group, and then write each unique stakeholder on a post-it, one per post-it. Then you want to draw the axes of influence and interest on a whiteboard, and then taking one stakeholder at a time, you want to have a round table discussion about where it is that the stakeholder should go on the axes, noting down if there are any interesting differences in views about a stakeholder and their influence and interest. Or sometimes you want to indicate that influence or interest is increasing or decreasing. So you can do that by adding an arrow. So once you've done that for all of the stakeholders, then you might come up with a map something like this. So that's your scoping done. That's it. You can either leave it at that, or you can use this map as a basis for boundary setting. So given your particular project outcomes and resources, making decisions about who it is that you're going to work with. So that's what we're going to go on to now. So it's likely that that those that you're going to be involved are going to come from the kind of top left, top right, and bottom right quadrants of the axis. So if somebody has kind of low interest and low influence, that you're probably not going to deal with them, but you're probably not going to want to include them. But that's not for sure. So you want to do this exercise with everyone. So what you do then, again in your diverse group, is look at one stakeholder at a time. And again, there are some useful questions that you can ask this group. So we'll run through the questions with a couple of stakeholders. So looking at these guys, so the local landowners from Frogmore Farm and Bigfield Farm. So the questions that we want to ask them, or we want to ask about them, of your diverse group. So why might they be important for the project? Why might they be interested or not interested? What could the stakeholder bring to or lose from the research? What stages could they be useful or important for being involved in? And to what degree of involvement? Then you consider, based on what the project's trying to achieve and the resources, whether to include or exclude them. So if you're including them, then you need to consider what you need to do to get them involved. And if you're excluding them, what are the consequences? So for these landowners on Frogmore and Bigfield Farm, as you can see here, they're pretty interested and pretty influential. So why might they be important? So the farmland in the area is an important contributor of sediment. So they might be important contributors themselves, and they might be more likely or keen to change practices if they've been involved in the project. They might be interested in the research as it might affect their future land practices, and we already know that at least one of the people on Frogmore Farm is particularly interested in gathering gathering shellfish and from the nearshore environment and fishing. So they bring critical knowledge about farming practices, strong practical and implementation knowledge. So that's what they could bring to the research. In terms of what they could lose something. If the research finds that some of their practices are problematic, it could limit their ability to use those practices in the future. So given how important they are, probably a high degree of involvement would be justified, probably at the level of collaboration, so where you jointly agree on what the project should cover, and they probably need to be involved right from the beginning. So project considerations, farmers are pretty critical to the success of the project, so we should try and involve them as much as possible, and from as early on as possible. How are we going to get them involved? Well, one person is already involved in this diverse group, and so they've said that they're going to approach their neighbour. So that might be an example of a discussion of a particularly interested and influential stakeholder. So what about a stakeholder that's somewhere else on the map? So ECAN, if we see ECAN is here, moderately influential, but not really very interested. So let's see what we could say about them. So why might they be important for the project? Well, they might be important because they set policies covering the impacts of land use on water, but they really aren't very interested, as they've got a lot of other much higher priorities. So what could they bring? They could bring policy knowledge, and they're pretty likely to benefit from the research if it's successful in reducing sediment. We note that we do have some others in the project who have policy knowledge. When would they be useful? So they'd be useful in the planning and the design of the project to understand the relevant policies and regulations, and the necessary degree of involvement will probably be Maybe consult with them at the beginning to get ideas, and then keep them informed. So project considerations. ECAN's pretty much too busy to be involved in the project, but we don't want to exclude them completely as they're the responsible agency. Sediment loss in the future might become more regulated, so let's use existing policy knowledge in the project, but keep both ECAN and the local zone committee people informed by sending them regular updates and inviting them to project results workshops. So once you've gone through this exercise with everybody on the on your list, then you can basically decide, you can color categorize people to denote how it is that you're going to work with them. So in this case, the guys in green are, we're going to include them in the project. The guys in blue, we're going to keep them informed about the project. And the people in yellow, we're going to not involve them in the project. So once you've done this with all of the stakeholders on the map, that's basically your first iteration of boundary setting. So at this stage, you need to remember to go back to those identified stakeholders who you said you want to work with, but who aren't in the diverse group that you've been discussing with, and check your understanding and discuss with them about their involvement in the project. Don't just assume that they're going to be involved. So that was influence and interest mapping. So in summary, it's a scoping and a boundary setting tool. It's useful for deciding who it is that you're going to work for and making those decisions more transparently. And it's a pretty simple pen, paper, question and post-it exercise. And that's us. Any questions?